Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. What will be, I know, a very exciting conversation, really interesting conversation with Justin Worland, correspondent at Time. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land upon which UC Santa Barbara is located. I want to pay my respects to the Chumash elders, past, present, and future, for they hold the memories, the traditions, and the culture of this area, which this area has become an important place of learning for people all over the world. I also feel it's necessary and appropriate to take just a moment to acknowledge the pandemic. We tend to rush into things, into business, and perhaps there's a service and a value to doing that, but like to just begin with a brief moment of silence to acknowledge families and loved ones that have been impacted directly and indirectly by the coronavirus. Thank you. A few housekeeping matters before we dive in. All participants are muted in our webinar except for our presenters. We'll begin with some keynote remarks in just a moment from Justin. We'll pivot for the larger portion of our conversation or our time together to dialogue. And that conversation will be moderated by Soshi Claire. Soshi, pleasure to introduce you. You're a UC Santa Barbara PhD student, ocean climate researcher, and a communicator. Soshi will take us into that conversation, will help us sort of dig down deeper on a key set of important issues that we'll raise. And then we'll open things up for questions from the floor towards the end. If you do have any questions at any point during a dialogue, please go ahead and enter those in the Q&A box down there at the bottom of Zoom. We won't be monitoring the chat, so please focus on submitting those questions over to the Q&A. Without any further ado, Justin, it's my real pleasure and privilege to introduce you. Thank you and welcome for taking time to join us today for this conversation. It's my understanding that there are a few things, to put it lightly, that are going on in DC these days. So we're so grateful, even more grateful for you carving out the time to join us in the conversation. As I mentioned at the start, Justin is a correspondent based in Washington, DC, with Time, has been with Time for over 6 years. Justin, you studied history at Harvard, where you served as the managing editor for the Harvard Crimson. You received a number of awards during your tenure in journalism, including most recently the SEAL Environmental Journalism Award. And your writing has been repeatedly featured on the cover of Time, multiple covers of Time, indeed, during this past year. My favorite cover in 2020 was, perhaps not surprising, the climate change cover of Time, in which so much of what you wrote and so much what was featured in Time about that subject was summarized, I thought, poignantly in a very arresting a way that arrested my attention with its simplicity. The title, One Last Chance. In just the last 12 months alone, you've written about a whole host of topics, many which are of critical interest to all of us: the election, environmental justice, and environmental racism, Supreme Court and what's at stake with this conversation and discussion around the Supreme Court, and climate change and political stability, climate perspectives in rural America, Black Lives Matter and systemic racism in the United States, COVID, climate, and green recovery options for the US, fires, oceans. And you wrote about Time's Person of the Year last year, Greta Thunberg. Could keep going on and on. All of these subjects of great importance to all of us, all subjects that we're interested in, that we're scared by, that we're engaged with, that we're enraged by, and on good days, that we're hopeful about. So much for me keeps coming back to that title, One Last Chance. There being a sense, at least for me, of existential urgency around not just climate change, but many of the topics that you write about. Sochi's going to give us a chance in a moment to dig deeper into each of these topic areas. But if I could turn to you first, Justin, for some opening remarks that perhaps sets the stage for this conversation, your view of all of these super important issues that are out in front of us today, your view from your desk at Time. Over to you, Justin.
Well, thank you so much, Doug. I'm really thrilled to be here. I have the opportunity to speak on panels on occasion, but it's rare to have the opportunity to really speak directly to scientists. And honestly, I'm so used to learning from all the work that you all do. It's a uniquely flattering I feel very honored and flattered to be able to speak to you all, and hopefully there's something in there that is something you can learn from in some way. I'm going to open my remarks with an anecdote. Last year, I had the interesting opportunity to travel across Iowa to, in the heat of the early days of the presidential campaign, to do a story about climate change and the role that it was playing or potentially playing in shaping the lead up to the Iowa caucus there. So, Iowa is a state that had experienced drought, it had experienced flood. It was kind of a microcosm of what's happening really in many parts of this country. Met a lot of people who lost their businesses due to flooding, people who were concerned about water contamination. The most interesting person I met was a man named Matt Russell. And so if we can go to the next slide, we'll see Matt. Matt is a farmer in Lacona, Iowa. He raises cattle and also produce. And he's also a climate activist. He runs a group that focuses on engaging people of faith on climate and getting rural Americans excited about climate change. The day that I visited, I wasn't alone. You can go to the next slide. I happened to visit the day that Kamala Harris was on the farm. And she walked around and had a nice conversation with Matt. And you can go to the next slide. This is a photo I took. There was also a bevy of journalists. This is probably half of the journalists who were there that day. The other half had positioned on places across the farm trying to get a good shot of Kamala and Matt. You can go to the next slide. Kamala was not the only presidential candidate who visited. Here's Beto O'Rourke and his wife meeting with Matt on the farm. And we can go to the next slide. And there's Joe Biden meeting with Matt on the farm. So all of these candidates had a nice discussion with Matt about climate change, about the role that farmers can play in the coming up with solutions to climate change. And Matt spoke to them. They engaged. Several of the candidates introduced plans related to farmers and climate change, but those were the candidates. How did the journalists? You saw the number of journalists who were there. How did they cover it? So we can go to the next slide. Many of them didn't write about it at all, but here are two, I think, very telling headlines from people who were there. One, can Kamala catch Joe and Elizabeth in Iowa? That's a horse race take on that conversation. And then my favorite really is O'Rourke campaigns with wife, looks to boost female support, right? So we have this really substantive conversation about climate change happening, and the coverage that comes out of it is about is about the fact that Beto O'Rourke brought his wife with him. So why do I tell this story, besides the fact that I think it's amusing in some ways? The reason is I think it really speaks to many of the challenges related to climate change and to communicating around climate change and covering climate change. And I also hope that take a step back. It shows many of the challenges related to communicating around climate change, and I think also illuminates some of the ways in which we can and should do a better job. I'll speak a little bit about the way that I try to incorporate these things into the work I do. I hope that there is maybe some tidbit in there that will be useful to you as you all think about the way that you communicate around climate change as well. So just, I'm gonna sort of the big overarching picture, I think, is that climate change is communicating around climate change, and climate journalism in particular is difficult. And I'm going to highlight a few reasons why. Climate journalism is difficult because climate science and climate solutions can be hard to understand for the uninitiated. Obviously, you all know that there is a level of background knowledge that's required to really understand the depth of the work that you do. And that gets even more challenging the more specific you get into the work. By definition, journalists aren't experts, and they're certainly not experts if they don't cover climate regularly. For me personally, it took several years of reading of asking really dumb questions, to scientists before I felt enough familiarity with the material to write confidently. And the same goes for climate solutions. A journalist who covers politics maybe doesn't know so much about the Clean Power Plan or carbon capture, and that's exactly what was at play, I think, at that farm scenario in Iowa. Right? They were having a nice conversation, in-depth conversation about carbon capture and sequestration, and if the average journalist there is like, I don't know what they're talking about, they're not going to write a story about it. It's just pretty common sense. The second reason I suggest climate change is hard to cover is that journalists are always looking for tension. Journalists report the news and the facts, but they're also intent on having a really good, compelling story that captures their audience. And that requires tension, which is ideally embodied by different characters. And so this is why the local news is more likely to report on crime, like a local crime event that maybe affects a few people, than air pollution that might be choking literally dozens or hundreds or thousands of people in an urban area. And so, going back to the farm, when you think about that cordial conversation they're having, it doesn't really create much tension. It's not as interesting as the race to capture women voters or the horse race more broadly. The final point I'll suggest about the difficulties of climate journalism is the strive for balance. Journalists are always looking for, it's the first thing you learn when you learn the journalism ropes. You have to make sure you represent all sides. This has arguably been one of the biggest, if not the biggest challenge, and one of the most egregious problems for climate journalism. From the beginning, journalists looked for, okay, we have a climate scientist, who's going to represent the contrasting view? And that did a lot of damage. I think that's changed. I think we've gotten to a point where that's not how journalists approach climate coverage, but it was for a long time. But it also raises this point related to the tension point I made earlier, which is if you really need to find balance, if you're looking for balance and you don't actually need to find that alternate view, then what's the tension? You don't see many news stories about gravity, right? Like the existence of gravity, because that's established, right? So if climate science is established, what do we have to say about it? We know that climate change is real. What more is there to add? So I'll then, those are the three problems I've outlined. Difficulty of communicating for the uninitiated, the need for tension, and then the struggle over what balance means. So I'd just like to offer a little bit of my perspective on how I work around that, and how the media more broadly works around it, and maybe there's something in there that's helpful for you all as well. So the big overarching takeaway I'd say is trying to meet people, where they are. And that's the way I would sort of characterize my coverage on climate. I think most good climate coverage tries to meet people where they are. And there's two ways I'll highlight. One is going local. And this is sort of self-explanatory, but the average person doesn't know what parts per million are, or what insert 6 meters of sea level rise means for for the country, for the world, et cetera. So what I try to do, and I think what good climate journalists try to do, is try to take these macro stories and really localize them. So if we look at my Iowa story, which was political, but also had sort of multifaceted, was a multifaceted look at the effects of climate on the ground. A good part of that story was devoted to flooding. So what I did was I visited very particular people, communities, had really in-depth conversations about their personal experience, and that was sort of the way into the story for somebody who might have no familiarity or interest in climate science. And then I zoomed out a level to look at the regional effects. What is the situation related to flooding and climate on the ground in Iowa? And to do that, I had a conversation, with a scientist on the ground in Iowa, right? So to a reader who, isn't necessarily inclined to be interested in climate change, it's a lot more believable to hear your Iowa State professor talking about climate science than an IPCC report. But then level 3 jumped out to the IPCC, talked about the global effects. And so there you have this story that starts very local and gives the bigger picture of what's really happening. I think there's a lot of different ways that this sort of local story is being told, whether it's the New York Times maps that show around the world what flooding will look like in different places. There's lots of different ways to tell this, and I think this has really been I don't want to say an innovation, but it's been something that's localizing stories has happened more frequently and with better quality in recent years, which I think is really a testament to a lot of good journalists. Excuse me. The second way I would suggest meeting people where they are is on a global scale, and trying to find the conversations that people are having in their living rooms right now, and just inserting yourself and inserting climate into those conversations. There's so much happening, right? I mean, the pandemic, there's the economic calamity, there's the reckoning of a race. Climate change, it's hard to compete sometimes, right? So the approach here is really just about thinking about how is climate change related to all these issues, and then finding a way to engage people in that conversation. And I think, it sounds a little abstract, but when you mentioned, Doug mentioned my One Last Chance story. The One Last Chance story is yes, a story about, in some ways, parts per million and the amount of carbon that we've dumped into the atmosphere. But it's also a story about how a confluence of events, the economic collapse, the pandemic, the election, has made 2020 really pivotal in the sense that we have a unique opportunity to address this that if we don't take, we'll be in deeper trouble. And so the point I'm making is that that's engaging people on this topic in a way that's really engaging the things that they're already talking about. The same thing could be said about the stories about environmental racism and environmental justice. I wrote a story for that same issue that was all about how the conversation around climate justice was changing, in large part due to this changed sort of national conversation. And that's a way to engage people on these things that they may not have thought about, and they now have a reason to think about. And I'll just say, there's a really funny thing about that story is that I pitched that story, a version of that story, long before the Black Lives Matter protests happened, and then that gave us an opportunity to really to move that conversation along. I'm going to just share my screen very quickly for just a final thing here. Okay. Just to share, we already, did I do that right? Or can you see everything on my screen? Well, it's okay. I don't have, there's nothing to be ashamed of here, I don't think. Hold on, sorry, I need to get to presentation mode because, as you can tell, I don't do this too often. Well, I'm gonna, you can see, what can you see here? Can you see?
We can see your PowerPoint deck with the slide with the cover image.
Okay. Well, this is we are going to just, oh, there we go. We're gonna this is gonna be what it is. I'm sorry, but you can see the cover here, which the image we shared was shared earlier. But I have to share it because beyond my story, this is really an amazing, I think, depiction that allows people to visualize what's happening with, whether it be the increase in carbon emissions or sea ice and or the increase in renewables. And then I just wanted to share these two other stories here. One was the environmental justice story I mentioned, but the other is just about schools, right? This is an example of a way we can reach people where they are, talking about the way in which the debate around reopening schools for COVID is very similar to the debate that happens right now in many small island developing states and other countries about how do you reopen after a natural disaster or a climate-related disaster. So just another example of a way to really insert climate into a conversation that people are already having. Well, okay, let me just end sharing my screen if I am technically competent enough to do that.
And Justin, as you're backing out there, if I can just mention that some have asked in the chat about access to those articles. If you just jump on Justin's Time profile page, you'll actually see a rundown of all of the articles that he's mentioned, plus a lot of the other writing in recent and further historical time there. So a good place to pick up those articles. Well, Justin, thank you.
Yeah, so yes, that was the conclusion of my remarks. I'm really looking forward to talking with you all, and thank you again for having me here.
Thank you. And you'd be amazed at how little we know about how things operate in your world, and how I think important it is that we, in our community, in the science community, get a better view of what's happening in the science journalism community. So thanks for at least a glimpse. So many places to go. Soshi, if I may, have you navigate us forward in conversation from here?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, both Doug and Justin. So many, like Doug said, so many things to explore. And of course, everyone, we are live on Zoom, like from our homes. So we've got already some technical difficulties. And I just wanted to say, if any airplanes go by, it's because I live near an airport, and I'll just mute my mic when they come. So I guess also, I just wanted to say again, thank you, Justin. If we were in person, we'd be welcoming you to our Oceanside campus with tons of palm trees. It'd be a lovely experience.
I'm sad I couldn't be there. It's a lovely place to be.
Yes, but we're still happy to have you here virtually. And just a little bit about myself, I'm a scientist that's also a theater artist. So communicating science has always been something that's been somewhat natural, but as we mentioned, it's still pretty challenging. And that's why we're so inspired by your work and the way that you really disseminate these tough topics. So it's really great to connect storyteller to storyteller and learn like what goes on beyond the magazine for you in your day to day. And just to remind everyone, we will be doing, 20 minutes of questions from the UCSB community, but everyone still continue to throw in questions in that Q&A, because we'll dedicate 10 minutes at the end to questions that are more live, and we'll address those too. So deep breath, everyone. The first topic is the election. And I guess we just want to get right to it and just ask you, the first question is, what is at stake for climate change, science, and the environment in this election? I know that's a lot to consider. So
yeah.
Yeah, so climate change, science, and the environment.
Yeah, I mean there's a lot there, of course. I guess I would start just really big picture, right, on climate. This is something that I'm sure everyone knows, but planet has warmed 1.1 degrees Celsius since the Industrial Revolution. We are ideally trying to keep temperature rise below to 1.5 or well below 2 degrees Celsius. So we have a really narrow margin. And Trump is likely to lock us into not necessarily a skyrocketing emissions scenario, but a sort of leveling off, where we're going to continue emitting on an unsustainable way. There's a few reasons for that. I mean, there's the obvious regulatory rollbacks, which would be solidified if he has a second term. I think it's also important to just look at the state of American infrastructure and the fact that we're likely to spend trillions of dollars over the next few years, particularly in stimulus funding, as a result of this pandemic. And that has the potential to lock us into decades of high carbon infrastructure. So that's the first really important point on the domestic front. I think the second thing is Trump has clearly sought to be a disruptor on the world stage, and that includes climate change. It's more than just pulling out of the Paris Agreement, though that's crucial. So I think there's an interesting question about what happens, what are the ripple effects around the world if the US, if we have a second term of Trump. I think it's actually sort of complicated because places like the EU are saying they're going to have a border carbon tax, which will penalize countries that aren't addressing climate change. China, a lot of people thought China was going to wait until after the election to make their big climate announcement, but they said, no, we're going ahead with net zero. So there's a complicated picture, but having Trump certainly doesn't help that picture. I think just to the science point, you know, one of the most detrimental effects of this administration for climate and environment and science is just the way in which the administration has really, for lack of a better word, attacked science. I mean, and that's sidelining scientists in every way seemingly possible. It's using shoddy scientific data and material to justify its regulations, and a lot of this has been tied up in the courts. A lot of it has been sort of caught up in bureaucratic wrangling. And a second term is really an opportunity for the administration to finalize what they've been doing for 4 years. So big stakes, and we could talk about that question for a whole hour. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah. Thank you. I guess it kind of goes into our next question, which is that right now, talking about climate change is highly polarized. The polarization of science is just more and more every single day. We see that, and I'm sure that you do in trying to communicate about these topics. From within politics, and then even beyond, like you mentioned, in the fields of Iowa. So, I guess we're just wondering, as how do we, as scientists, as the public, just in general, and having conversations with each other, how are we going to move beyond the politicization of climate change in these discussions and storytelling? And how have you thought about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting and important question. I would say a few things. One, it's challenging because I know, as you're speaking as a scientist. I mean, it's difficult. What role can a scientist play? And I think the biggest thing is that it's not scientists' faults, right? Like, the politicization is the result, I think, in some part, the failure of media. It's also, malign financial interests from, say, fossil fuel groups, and I think in some ways it's just ideology. So I think the responsibility of the people in the know, of the scientific community, is to continue speaking honestly, and without fear, of upsetting people, but to speak honestly and forcefully. And I think it's part of my job to figure out how to communicate that and translate that. But I just think that scientists are not responsible for this problem, and what they should be doing is continuing to do their good work, and I mean, of course, supporting people and causes that help communicate. But I just don't know that it's on scientists to change the way that they think about these things.
Yeah, and I guess I wonder too, how do you do this in your own writing? I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah,
in your
no,
work,
it's a
and
really
engaging people who disagree with you, because that's really tricky. That's the tricky part.
it's really interesting, right? So I would say first, I don't view it as my mission to change the minds of climate deniers. And I'll say why. This is something people ask me this question: how do you reach climate deniers? And the truth is, if in 2020 you're denying the science of climate change, it's not because you didn't stumble on the right Time article, right? It's because of deeply held beliefs that are related to a whole slew of different things. Um, However, I think it is part of my job to reach people who haven't thought much about it, who maybe are skeptical because they haven't really engaged. And to do that, I would go back to what my presentation was about: meet people where they are. Find ways to engage them, on local things that are of concern to them. Find ways. I mean, it's interesting sometimes to have conversations about, sometimes when I talk to Republicans, I don't even talk about the science of climate change. I say, the EU, you don't have to understand the science. The EU is going to create this tax that's going to tax, imports from other countries. What is, you're concerned about business. What does this mean? What is your perspective on that? So I think it's finding ways to reach people where they are, and but I don't think I don't know that I or any one of us is going to be able to convince the deniers.
Yes, and I think that I guess kind of moving into the next set of questions on communication, since we're already there, It does feel, at least for scientists more and more, that we want to kind of participate in the understanding of the work that we're doing. And I think a lot of scientists, myself included, are really trying to take maybe a little bit more responsibility for communicating, like you said, having stronger wording about, our findings instead of being like, well, it's 0.8 possible or something like that. And I think it's largely because of the fact that all these issues are affecting people in public health ways, and it's super critical, I think, that we say the right thing. And so I guess for us, the scientists that are trying to maybe, work more at being better at that, what advice might you have in, communicating with writers who will then take that next step for, really bringing it to the public?
Well, I just want to say, I hope I didn't say anything to suggest I think scientists shouldn't be communicating. I just think that, it's really, I just want to be clear that I don't think it's the fault of scientists that we're in this sort of place that we're in. And, I don't think that I think that climate deniers have their own thing going on. So that's what I would just say as a preface. But I think it goes back to some of the things I was talking about in the presentation, which is finding ways to take science and make it accessible to what you think will be accessible to a public, but also to writers such as myself. So thinking about things like what are the characters, like how can I tell this in a way that is really showing the implications for people. Where is, and you don't have to talk about this personally, but to point to where is the tension here that a writer might want to write about. Now, you can just say, I'm going to be on background or off the record, but think about this. Like, that's a good tactic, right? It's to say to a writer, you should think about this. I don't want to be quoted, but think about this. And point to those tensions, point to those characters. Oftentimes for me, science undergirds everything I write, but it's not necessarily the focus of the whole story, right? Like the story might be, a lead about people and place, and then a discussion of policy, and then there's 2 paragraphs about the science, and there's science sprinkled throughout the story. But I think it's a little bit about thinking about, okay, I have this science, what do I build around it that would be useful to a writer who might want to write about my work? I hope that's helpful.
Oh yeah, that's absolutely helpful. And I guess I also wanted to know, just from the perspective of, say, media, people who are interested in journalism, storytelling, and working with scientists, when you interview people rarely do get to the point. Sometimes, they don't share their most salient answers right away, and it takes a little bit of circling. So I guess I was just wondering, what would you suggest? Is it, what do you do to ask the right questions to help experts kind of get to the point and share what's really important to know? And I think that's something a lot of people, outside of science, come to us, and I think they, what would you give advice to somebody who's interested in starting environmental journalism like that?
That's an interesting question. Truthfully, I guess it's like I ask my favorite question to scientists oftentimes is just the most open-ended question, right? Which is it kind of contrary to the way that you framed it, which is just because if you ask a very specific question, you get a very specific answer. And if you ask a very broad question, you might get a 5 or 10 minute answer, but there'll be something in those 5 or 10 minutes that you're like, that's the thing that I want to know. And then you can follow up from there. But I really like, my first question and my last question are almost always like, so tell me what, you wrote this paper, I read it, but tell me about it. And then maybe there's a thread to pull out of that. And if not, I go into my questions. And my final question is, okay, we just talked for half an hour, whatever. What did you miss? What when you just said a lot of things, what is like the important thing that you didn't say that you think needs to be said? And I think after talking for 45 minutes, people are like, oh, there's that thing. So I think broad questions is my answer.
Oh, that's so great. Thank you for sharing that. And then I guess also, environmental justice is something that people are talking a lot about lately, and it's been the focus of some of your work too. And we know that, the African American distinguished professor, Robert Bullard, has coined the term, environmental justice 50 years ago. It's been a long time that people have been working on these issues, but now it seems to have a little bit of a different ring to it. And I just want to know, personally, considering your background, your racial background, like, what does environmental justice mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, there the disproportionate challenges that face African Americans in this country and people of color broadly are really staggering. I feel fortunate that I didn't grow up next to a fossil fuel plant, et cetera, and so I don't have that sort of personal experience living it. Having said that, I do feel a responsibility. I think that a lot of my colleagues, for no fault of their own necessarily, but maybe don't feel to really report those stories and to listen to those voices. I mean, and it's something as simple as being in a room, being in a room for a national environmental group and looking around and saying, well, there's really, the perspectives here are really narrow. And I think that's something that does come as a result of, my experience as an African American. So I think it's the question of feeling a responsibility to listen to those voices and report on those voices. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. That's so wonderful to hear, actually. And I guess I kind of going back to climate change. I guess this is more of a sciencey question. So, from the way that we, address all the different ways that we're going to, at the same time, move forward to address, climate change and how it affects communities. We, what if say, let's say, if you were elected president of the United States, what priority steps would you take to kind of get us back on track in terms of that? I know that you wrote a lot about that in your article on our last chance for 2020, and so if you could just touch upon some of those things. And of course, it might be a little bit too late for you to hop in and take a punch at Kamala.
Yeah. I'm just I'm imagining what, like, the world is so crazy, so I'm trying to envision the chain of scenarios that would happen that would lead to that. But no, I think so. I'll take this quite as a journalist, I avoid talking about this is the policy solution that I endorse, but I'll answer this question, I think, in the way I would answer it, which is, it makes me think of this study that I wrote up last year from the IMF. And the IMF did this whole analysis of all these different policy solutions around climate, and they concluded that carbon pricing was the most efficient way to reduce emissions. But their sub-finding, and the finding that I wrote up, was carbon pricing is the most efficient, but actually just do something. Just do anything to move the ball forward, because any action to reduce emissions is better than nothing. And so I think that there's a lot of debate that's going to happen between now and January and whenever about what particular avenue should be pursued. And of course, there are important details to be hashed out. But I think the avenue that I guess I would pursue, or I think any president who cares about this issue will pursue, is the avenue that is politically viable, and any of those are going to move us forward. I mean, and I guess thinking sort of analytically about what avenues are politically viable, I think spending a lot of money to support green jobs, to build out green infrastructure, that's politically viable because it can be done with fewer votes in the Senate, and you can get a bipartisan majority to support that. And then I think setting standards, probably through regulatory agencies or through executive action that doesn't require big sweeping legislation. Those are probably the most politically viable avenues, and therefore I think the avenues that I or anyone would pursue. But I also think, I mean, talking about environmental justice, I think it's building a coalition is a big part of this. And so there's going to need to be some consideration of how do we make sure we keep environmental justice activists on board? How do we make sure we have a really broad tent who are supporting this legislation? We've seen in the past, like 2009, with the attempts to pass cap and trade, that failed in large part because there wasn't a big coalition. So it's about political viability yeah, so that was a winding answer to that question, but
Yeah, that was a big question. So
yeah, it is a big question.
yes, and I guess before we move on to the questions that are coming in live, I just want to just ask you, where are you now, and what's next for you? So in your Zoom time universe or virtual time universe.
Do you mean like physically? Wait,
Yeah,
what?
where are you talking to us from?
Well, I'm talking from like from sort of this like makeshift. It's like I mean, it doesn't really look that compelling from behind me, but like a makeshift little office in an apartment that I like moved from in the same building that I was in before, like a month and a half ago, and everything has just been so crazy. So it looks like totally disastrous. But I'm looking forward to. I mean, the election has really, dominated everybody in DC's life, and so it's been my focus for some time, and I'm looking forward to, like, hopefully in a few weeks having a decisive result and being able to take a deep breath and clean up my sort of immediate surroundings as well.
Aw, awesome. And I guess working remotely, and how has that been? Just curious.
Yeah, no, I mean, my job, I mean, I love talking to people on the ground. Like, that's part of the appeal of my job. It's part of, I think, how you really get rich stories that are sort of more than, writing up a report, is going places and talking to people. And it's hard to do that remotely. I mean, it just means relying on talking to the same people that I've talked to before. And so it's challenging from a reporting perspective, for sure. So I'm looking forward to I'm looking forward to when there's an opportunity to engage in person with people.
Yes, I'm sure we all are.
Yes, I'm not alone. That's true. That's fair.
Yes, and I guess just to kind of move into some of the questions that are coming in live, and this is kind of one that we also have in the UCSB community, is it's about hope. So of course, we do need to, really make known all of the issues that we're facing, and making sure that people are aware of what's happening. But also, what gives you hope, and um, how do you balance that note in your work?
Yeah, well, I would say what gives me hope is just, in 2008, 1% of Americans said climate change was the most important issue to them. In 2016, climate change didn't come up at all in the general election debates. Just last year, activists were pushing for a climate debate because they were afraid it wouldn't get mentioned. And now, on Thursday, climate change is one of the marquee topics in the debate. There is a rich, vibrant conversation ongoing about how we can address these issues, and that leaves me hopeful. And I think that's in large part due. I think it's a little cliche, but it's due to young people who are really excited and motivated on this issue, which is changing the conversation, and that also gives me hope. I mean, I think it's important to write about hopeful things as well as dismal things. And so, the Person of the Year story, that Doug mentioned earlier, this is a hopeful story, right? I mean, it's a terrifying story, right? Greta's whole MO is to share the terrifying news in blunt terms, but she's also, a representative of a generation that's standing up. This is hopeful. So I think on balance, I write more about the dismal things, but there's also, it's important to write about the hopeful things too.
Yes, and I guess so some questions coming in live are that we see in recent years the private sector, which to a scientist like, ooh, what's that? Has made leaps towards fighting climate change, actually, through renewable energy investments and things like that. And so how can we, and I think a lot of people are wondering about this, at the same rate in pushing private sector towards addressing climate change, how can companies help tackle environmental justice in an equitable way?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's, I mean, a few things. I think the private sector has made leaps and bounds on this issue. I think the biggest thing, it's one thing to eliminate your carbon footprint as a corporation, which is of course hugely important, but it's important to put money behind the public policy position, because as much as some of these big corporations are going to engage positively on these issues on their own, they need to push others, because not all of them will. Um, and I think that's true with environmental justice as well, right? Like, for companies that have lobbyists, who are talking about other things, they need to talk about environmental justice. I think there's lots of questions, right? Like related to how can corporations think about these questions of siting? Where do you site a facility? How do you deal with the cleanup from a facility? And I mean, the simple answer would be many companies need to do better. They need to just take these issues seriously and address them. But I think the bigger answer is really just to push public policy to ensure a framework for everyone to play by the same set of rules, which are that will address these concerns.
Right. And I guess this is another question. I'll take probably two more that are coming in live. Um, so oftentimes, we, might hear criticisms that perhaps, journalists and media outlets, maybe you might have heard, are missing critical environmental justice stories because of, it says, business metrics or politicized landscape. Is that something that you've experienced, and how might you respond to those kinds of just general criticisms in general?
Because what was the because I missed that?
So question is, how do you respond to coverage criticisms by those in climate and environmental activist communities who might say that journalists or media outlets are missing critical environmental justice stories because of business metrics or the political landscape? So basically just asking, like, how do you respond to these criticisms that are very pointed?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that the issue with I would say absolutely journalists are missing environmental justice stories, and that's because journalists aren't in the places where these stories are happening. There's a dearth of local media, and so there's all sorts of environmental justice stories that go uncovered, and the way that stories sort of trickle up to the national news involves local media. And so I think absolutely journalists are missing these things. And I don't know, about business metrics, et cetera. I don't really know about that. I certainly don't feel any sort of imperative about what to cover or not to cover based on those sorts of metrics. And I think how do I respond to pointed criticism? I think hear it out. I mean, I'm always happy to hear criticism, and if it's fair and constructive, to think about it. And I'll be honest, like, there are, particularly in my early days doing this, people who wrote back with a piece of criticism, and sometimes it's still in my head, as I'm writing something, and I'll think about that thing that somebody emailed me about, 4 years ago, and I'm conscious of it. So I think criticize us, make it nice, make it constructive, but criticize us, because that helps us grow.
Wonderful. I'll take the last question, which it seems like there are a lot of questions coming in about, we've kind of, as scientists, there's this divide right now. There's intellectualism. There's a lot of really, the energy is not so good between scientists and the public, especially on the topic of climate change. And I guess, from your perspective, this is kind of touching back to what we spoke to earlier, in ways to talk about things with nuance that also, that are personal and that can reestablish this relationship of trust and the facts that we are kind of trying to, spew out. And is there a way that journalists can play a role in this? How can scientists kind of be a part of that, like, rebuilding process of us coming together on public knowledge?
Well, that's a very that's a really good, important question. I would like to, to whoever asked that, throw it back and say, how can I help you, communicate that story? Because I think, it's important. I mean, I think the key is to have conversations with journalists about, what you're thinking and feeling, and perhaps there's a way to build a story, out of that. I mean, I think the other thing, of course, is writing op-eds and communicating that way. I think, I mean, I personally think that there should be more scientists writing, in the public space, and that's just something that that would, I think, aid that mission. So I don't know. I don't have a great answer to that, but I think that it certainly would be helpful. And you can email me. I'd be happy to have the conversation.
Oh, wonderful. Yes, I think it's something that we do need to come together. I think from all disciplines, we can really help each other out in solving some of these problems. So thank you for opening your virtual door.
Of course.
And that'll conclude our questions, but thank you.
Well, thank you so much for the questions. I enjoyed that. So.
And popping back in, thank you both. I mean, I could just sit there and listen and learn for another 10 hours. So thank you, Soshi, and thank you so much, Justin. So much learning being transmitted in that conversation. And a million questions that we didn't get to answer. Perhaps some part of the conversation we can carry forward, at least by tracking your writing, Justin, pointed a moment ago to where your writing's archived through time, but probably some pretty interesting things coming out in the next few weeks. And then, as you pointed out, a long but super important journey ahead of us, hopefully a chance for each of us to catch our breaths in a few weeks. But looking forward to tracking that conversation virtually. As we kind of come to a close here, I wanted to throw the mic back your way, Justin. Just so many things going on in the orbit of this conversation, from people to climate to science to media and all things around those topics. Any last concluding thought or set of thoughts that you have for us to take away, to just sort of digest and process and stand ready to sort of be with you in this sort of ecosystem of change that you're leading from your vantage point in journalism?
Yeah, well, I'm going to just say one quick remark, which is, please do email me, or most of my colleagues, I'm sure, who write about science and climate change would love to hear from you. So don't be shy. I mean, it might take us like a few days to respond because email is crazy, but we would love to hear from you. So please do that, and don't be shy about it. I think, just for a closing remark, I don't know. I mean, this is oftentimes my answer to the what gives hope question, which comes up, is I just think about a quote from Ho-Sung Lee, who leads the IPCC. When they came out with the 1.5 report, he said something to the effect of, every bit of warming matters. And what he meant was, every little bit between 1.5 and 2 degrees is essential. And we're probably going to blow past that 1.5 target, possibly the 2-degree target. But I always just think about that quote because, you get the question of well, and obviously nobody here would think this, but why don't we just give up? and I think about that answer, every little bit of warming matters. And that's sort of no matter how far behind we are, and no matter how many challenges there are, I keep thinking, could always be worse, and there's always something for us to do. I don't know. I don't know that that's inspirational for any of you, because this is, you are the actual scientists, but it's what I think about, and it's my sort of closing thought before I head off to my next project is, keep thinking about that little bit of warming.
Well, thank you, Justin. I'm going to write that little nugget of hope onto my hard drive and come back and replay it when in need. And I think it's probably a nugget of hope we can all hang on to. Well, thank you for all of the leadership that you're giving to the conversation, all of the conversations that you're engaging with. Thanks for the primacy importance you place on science in your journalism. Thanks for carving out the time to have a conversation with you. Soshi, thank you for leading such a smart and excellent conversation. And thanks certainly to all of the folks in the audience who carved out time as well to join us for the conversation. Much gratitude, very appreciated. So thank you, everyone, and I wish you all a good afternoon.
Thank you.